Well, great to be with you, first of all, and thanks for a discussion of a really important topic because nobody has quite explained in this debate, whether it's the White House or the Congress, how we got to the situation that we're in. Here are the basic numbers. If you look at the debt that the government owes to the public, not that the government owes to other units of the government, it's something around $25 trillion, not quite the 31 trillion, because some of that is owed to the Federal Reserve, for example. Okay, these are technicalities. 25 trillion is still a big number, and it's nearly 100% of our annual output in the country, which is the gross domestic product. Now, back in the year 2000, the debt that was owed by the government was only 35% of the gross domestic product. So it went from being 35% of national income back in the year 2000 to nearly 100% of our national income today. That's a pretty steep increase. That means that we are spending, but not covering that spending by taxes, but covering that spending by borrowing. And obviously, we've been borrowing a lot. The point of my article is that really a lot of that borrowing has gone to fund these useless, wasteful, destructive wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, now Ukraine. That's awful. And when you look at the estimates by the Watson Institute at Brown University, they say that the cost of these wars is about $8 trillion if you combine them, not even up to today, but up to a couple of years ago. Now, there are some definitional issues and some timing issues that mean that we should go a little bit deeper at the technical level. But the point is that if we had kept our debt at 35% of GDP rather than at 100% of GDP, that is about 65% of GDP, or 2/3 of today's GDP of 24 trillion. You do the arithmetic, that's about a $16 trillion, $15 to $16 trillion increase of debt beyond what would have kept the debt at a level relative to income. So what the Watson Institute estimates are showing is that about half of that has gone to war. I think even more than half has really accounted for by the military, because in addition to the war spending, we're funding 800 military bases around the world. We're funding a bloated intelligence world. We're funding all sorts of things that the military-industrial complex likes, that Raytheon or General Dynamics or Boeing or those that are selling weapons like, but are a waste for the American people. Now, mind you, the other half of that increase of debt came from the 2008 financial crisis, which blew a hole in the budget. That was Wall Street excess, let me put it that way. Another part came from the pandemic. Various things could be said about that. But basically, between war, financial crisis, and the pandemic, that's where our budget was blown. And here's the challenge I would put to President Biden. I'm completely against what we're doing in Ukraine because I think this war could have been avoided. I think it has a lot to do with the U.S. relentless push to expand NATO, which, by the way, is a military-industrial complex lobbying goal. That's what they lobby for. They love selling weapons to new NATO members. They want to keep expanding NATO. And other countries, including Russia, say, stop coming up to our border. Okay, so I think this war could have been avoided, but Biden really is part of the military-industrial complex, has been as a senator, a vice president, now as president. He's always backed NATO enlargement. He's backed NATO enlargement to Ukraine. I think it's been reckless. I think it's the reason we have this war. So I'm saying, okay, if you really want to make a deal, stop this wasteful spending, get the military budget under control. But by the way, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are talking about this almost at all.
Yes, it's up to us, right?
They're gonna slash the social safety net, which is already in tatters in this country, and then protect the military spending.
Well, so that we can have more war. Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, Jeffrey Sachs, because I know that at one point during this debt crisis, Republicans were adamant about reducing spending. We even had our House Speaker, I'll put that in quotes, Kevin McCarthy promised the Freedom Caucus and promised the American people that we would not issue a blank check for Ukraine. And now we're up to over $115 billion. Half of that, an estimated half, for weapons and military training. The latest being that the U.S., Biden has agreed that the United States will train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets.
Unbelievable, because it's nonstop escalation. More weapon systems, more destruction, more deaths, more spending. And I remember what I wanted to say, which is I would challenge President Biden, if he wants to continue on this path of the Ukraine war, which I think is tragic and completely solvable if he would stop the NATO enlargement and say to the Russians, go home and we don't go into Ukraine. And that's how you end this war. But I'd like him to say, okay, if we're going to spend more money, we're going to raise taxes to do it. Let's put it to the American people. Fund this, not just put it on the debt. And I'd say to the Republicans also, you want the war? Tell the American people they're going to pay more taxes. You want to have a war in Asia with China? Okay, raise the taxes for that. See how the American people feel about that. They don't dare do it. That's why the debt keeps going up, because these wars are not popular at all. And by the way, they don't want to ask the American people their views about anything. So they just put it onto the debt without asking us, do we really want to have this tragic war in Iraq? Do we really want to have a CIA-led operation to overthrow the Syrian government? Do we really want to bomb Libya back into rubble? They never asked us on any of this stuff. And if they just put it onto the debt, but if they said, okay, this is really important, and we're going to raise taxes to do it, then we could have a good debate in this country. Is this really important, or is this good for General Dynamics? Is this good for Boeing? Is this good for the military-industrial complex? We don't have that debate right now because they hide it on the debt.
That's right. And few people realize that the Department of Defense, Department of War, it used to be called, it should still be called, has never passed an audit. That's because there's missing money and people can't explain where this money has gone. And now we're just hurling money, spending about $6 billion to prop up the government in Ukraine, rather than saying, we'll support a ceasefire, we'll sit down, we'll negotiate with Putin, with Zelensky, maybe have two tracks of diplomacy, but we want to end this war now. No, instead, Biden has committed the United States to train Ukrainian pilots on these F-16 fighter jets, which could take a year or two. I mean, that's in essence saying we're committed to further death, destruction, the risk of nuclear war for another 2 years. But let's get back for a minute to the debt, so-called debt crisis, because you're an economist, Jeffrey Sachs. I want answers to a couple questions in the weeds. Okay. So we have this, you say it's a $24 trillion debt. If you really examine it, the media is saying 31 trillion. Anyway, the point is, where are we getting this money? It's debt. Who do we owe it to? How are we raising this money to pay for all of these wars, including the war in Ukraine?
So the government borrows. It borrows from the public. It borrows from foreign governments that hold this debt. It borrows from foreign wealth holders that owe this debt. And to some extent, the borrowing is okay, but we went from owing 35% of our income to 100% of our gross domestic product. And what the Congressional Budget Office signals is that if we keep on the current policies, the debt will rise to around 160% or even higher of our gross domestic product by mid-century. In other words, we're on an upward spiral because no side, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, want to talk about spending to cover wars and the military budget. Neither one wants to talk about taxing the rich. By the way, that's true not just of the Republicans who fight that, the Democrats fight that. President Biden announces for re-election, and where does he go immediately? To wealthy donors. He goes to Wall Street. This is both parties. Come on. This is why the rich don't pay taxes. So we're on a spiraling rise of debt. You can carry some debt. We all, carry a mortgage maybe if you own a home. Some people have consumer debt and so forth, but you keep it under a limit so that it doesn't get out of hand. And for a while, the interest rates were very, very low. So the government said, oh, look, we can borrow. It doesn't matter. We'll just keep borrowing. But you know what? It turned into inflation. Now the interest rates are going up because the Fed is once again raising interest rates to try to staunch inflation. And suddenly the debt service burden, in other words, how much we have to pay on just interest on this debt, is rising by percentage points of GDP, eating up invaluable tax revenues that we need to help educate our kids, for normal society, for fighting the pandemics and the mental health and the crime and other things that we have a social safety net for, but it's now going to go to debt service. And that is why you keep your debt under control, so that when you collect revenues, you can use it for the important things, not simply to pay interest on what you borrowed in the past.
Now, when we're paying this interest, Jeffrey Sachs, are we paying this interest to Japan, a large holder of U.S. debt, to China, another large holder of U.S. debt? Did they buy treasury bonds? Is that the debt that we're talking about?
Yeah, we pay the interest on anyone that holds U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That includes a lot of foreign governments, as you've mentioned. It includes a lot of wealthy people in the United States. It includes a lot of pension funds, insurance funds, money market funds backed up by U.S. Treasury bills. Government borrows by selling its bills and bonds in a kind of open market that any wealth holder can buy to include in their wealth or their asset portfolio. So it's wealth holders all over the world of all kinds, from pension funds and insurance funds and money market funds and foreign exchange reserves of other governments. The point from our governmental point of view is that's okay if it's 35% of GDP, even if it's 50% of GDP. By the way, it's okay if it went up to 100% of GDP and we had used the difference for making wonderful investments that were going to boost the economy. But where did that increase of debt come from? That 16 trillion that I talked about, what was it used for? Was it used for modernizing our infrastructure and making everything work well in the US? No, it went to wars, down the drain. It went to the veterans spending for all the wounded soldiers that suffered from this, a huge bill, human disaster, financial and fiscal disaster. It went also for this Wall Street debacle in 2008 when they were playing games with subprime mortgages, and we ended up with a massive recession. And it went to the spending on the COVID pandemic. And so we don't have the infrastructure or the investment, the physical capital, as the counterpart of all that borrowing. We have a lot of waste. It's very sad. We ran up the debt and we have nothing to show for it except, my God, why did we do that?